We're greeted in the exhibition by different types of seagoing vessels designed to travel long distances, like a galleon, a junk and a cruiser in the first gallery downstairs. Please can you tell us about the ship as a theme in your work?
For me, a ship is a vessel to carry you on a journey, but also from a place of conflict to a place of safety. It involves trade. It's about going for a new life, you know, hope for a better life. It's a container. It's almost like a container for the soul, almost. I mean, people think very differently about model boats than they do about model planes, and also I think of things like the Navy. The idea of the Navy comes from the idea of the nave of a church. So ships and churches are quite closely linked, and yeah, people have a very, very, very different connection to them, and not just that, a very different connection to people. People see model boats in a very different way.
And there's also in that first gallery there's a Chinese ship as well, a junk. Could you tell us a bit about that work?
Yes, this junk came to London as part of China's, Beijing's handover to London for the Olympics. And it's an example of soft power, shall we say. And I find that quite fascinating. I remember watching it, this beautiful thing sailing up and down the Thames. You know, the Tower Bridge opens and this junk sails through. And it's flying the Chinese flag and that. And it was quite interesting. And what I've done is I've surrounded it by imagery of trade, you know, container ships, oil tankers, but all about China's position in the world today. And it's alluding to how we react to that. As I often say, Christmas, it was once an article in the newspaper that Christmas comes on a container ship, literally from China, which I find completely fascinating. All the iPads, iPhones come from China. China is now so embedded in our daily lives. The whole show is a kind of poetic essay. So trying to pick one thing out and about something, this is about that. It's about much more than what it looks like. And I'm always aware of nuances and shifts. I mean, and what the work is, what the painting of the Chinese junk meant when I made it means something different to me today in the context of Brexit. You know, in how things are today, and that work evolves. Work is never, for me, my work is never static. It evolves and shifts, and with time, the evolution of time, you know.
We move into the second gallery, and there's a beaded work on the walls there, titled "The Nameless." Can you tell us something about these mythical characters, their instruments, and their armory?
The idea came from me wanting to do something which was a stream of consciousness thing, a collection of imagery which merges ideas and things, imagery I've been doing for quite a long while. So you have things like a horseman, potentially a winged horseman of the apocalypse, and sitting on his head is a mummy, a mummified figure, and you have things like there's a figure, a flute player, but he's wearing a mask from a Benin ivory mask, and it's about history mashing together. Next to him, next to the figure with the Benin mask, this flute player, is a figure who is worshipping him, standing on a kind of Baroque AK-47 submachine gun, and it's the thing I always refer to is a quote by the director, great director, film director John Huston, And he's an old man, and he's saying, you know, I look back at my life, and it's like looking through loads of rooms filled with people, and I'm looking back down through the ages, through the time, and he sees this endless procession of nameless characters, this endless procession, and I thought, that's it. That's what this is about, you know. So it's and for me, this is. It's an endless thing, this particular piece. It could continue into the next room, and the next room, and the next room. And it's inspired by things like Assyrian reliefs, you know, this endless procession. Also, the Triumph of Caesar by Mantegna. It's about myth, it's about power, it's about dreams, fears, you know. But then, trying to make something beautiful at the same time.
And in the final room, in the first floor, we see The Tourists, which takes place on HMS Belfast, which of course has been a museum since the 1970s. How did you intervene in that history?
It was quite simple. I mean, the HMS Belfast, I did a lot of research in it, and I found out that the last voyage came through Jamaica, just at the time of Jamaica's independence. Basically, they were there to sign off on the independence thing. It's like a benign gunboat diplomacy. So they get to Trinidad, and my idea is that they arrived in Trinidad in August, and my idea in the summer, and my idea was that they arrived in Trinidad several months before, in time for Carnival. So the whole crew is getting ready for Carnival. I had this commission to do something on HMS Belfast, and I was struggling to figure out what to do. And what I figured, all you needed to do to change the narrative of the boat, to make it more complex, was put masks on the mannequins who are there every day, doing everyday tasks. And yeah, it seemed to work. And they allowed me to do it, which the curators allowed me to do it, which took a lot of guts, basically.
There's also a DJ as well?
Yes, playing Harry Belafonte tunes. And the music was important. They had playing tunes like Brown Skin Girl and stuff. And these are almost cliche Caribbean tunes and folk songs and calypsos. But the lyrics are talking about something quite different and more problematic. Basically talking about a Madame Butterfly situation whereby sailors go off and have affairs with women all on their travels, and then just walk out on them, you know what I mean, and then leaving them with these kids with no dad, kind of thing. And also so there are lyric sheets there. One of the songs playing was Rum and Coca-Cola, in the original thing. And Rum and Coca-Cola by the Andrews Sisters. I always wonder whether they knew what they were singing about, because this is a iconic song of its day and through the 50s and stuff. It's again a cliche song, but it's about prostitution, and it's about prostitution. Basically, it's about the U.S. Army and prostitution in Trinidad, you know. And I just wanted to point that out. Also, what the piece is dealing with as well is the complex nature of the hero, because the piece is not a criticism, I should say, of the Navy at all. It's just it's more complex than that, you know. It's about the idea of the hero these days has changed, you know, for many reasons. And the idea behind this is that these are real people, real men, you know, who have a very earthy sense of humor, and they're doing an extremely boring job most of the time, which for a day or half a day or hours become a very terrifying, exciting job, a terrifying job, should we say. And that's what the thing is trying to put across, the fears behind what their inner fears, basically. That's what this is about. So in the first gallery, there's an image of HMS Belfast. And that is quite an important image to me. No, I decided to do that image because I watched the procession, the Queen's Jubilee procession with all the boats going down the Thames. And I started noticing HMS Belfast, and I noticed it as a sort of iconic thing, iconic London thing, but an iconic British thing. And I thought, well, let me try and do a piece of art about this. It's, again, because it's so visible, it's just, people don't pay attention to it, it's just there, you know. So let's work on this. So I did a photograph, aged the photograph, and it's surrounded with imagery from the Korean War and from the current Korean struggle. Now, the reason for this was because in Guyana, a socialist country, had very close ties with Korea. A lot of our doctors came from Korea. But it was about the idea of comics I read as a kid, where it was the communists versus the good old US of A, you know. And I found that really, really bizarre. And also the Korean War comics, which I had as a kid, just seemed really weird. Why are they fighting? There was an understanding of World War II. The reason for that is clear. But why these? As a kid, I couldn't understand what the issue was, if you see what I mean. So all this comes back to me while I'm working on these things. Yeah? And HMS Belfast took part in the Korean War. So that was the reason for pinning it onto that. Because of that particular piece of work, and because it was an odd thing to find a contemporary artist working about this particular issue, that was the reason why the Imperial War Museum commissioned me to do a piece on HMS Belfast, hence the tourists.
The photographic print Hinterland brings the spectre of royal imagery into the show. What does the statue mean to you?
The statue, that's the basis of a childhood memory of seeing the statue, the Queen Victoria statue outside what was before independence, the Victoria Law Courts. After independence, Guyana, and after Guyana becomes a republic, they took that statue and dumped it at the back of the Botanical Gardens, a bit like people would have done, say, to the statue of Lenin or something like that years later. And I saw this statue broken and battered at the back of the gardens, and that was quite weird. It was a very surreal place. At the back of the Botanical Gardens was what we would say in Guyana, behind God's back, you know what I mean? Nobody goes there, you know what I mean? And years later, this statue was, her head, which had been knocked off, was put back on again and it was replaced because time had passed, independence had, the country was independent, much more confident, and so it was just history now, you know. And so let's put it back. So the Queen Victoria statue is now back in front of Guyana law courts, and that's what that image is about. All that history. A lot of my work is about history to a certain extent, but it's not just history. It's about how we are now affected by history, the burden of history. I mean, and that's how I see things at this particular point in time, because this country is going through a lot of turbulence, and the turbulence has to do, I think, a lot to do with how things are, but then there are historical reasons for this turbulence.
There's a layering of materials in the exhibitions and an implicit commodity there in terms of the use of plastic. You're also physically layering the work, which is reflecting the histories as well. Could you talk a bit about that?
Right. Well, the layering of objects is simply how I make work. I started sculpture modeling clay, you know, not carving. So you literally, in that process, which I started many years ago, you're literally building up a layer, a bit of clay, a bit of clay, a bit of this, bit of that, to get the figure. So that's how I operate. So it's logical then to model these boats up, to add stuff layer upon layer, to finally achieve something which is like, okay, fine, this is it. The plastic objects in here, I haven't found an alternative for the plastic vegetation. I use a fraction of what I used to use many years ago. But it's just become part of the work. And it's something which is trying to pretend it's something else. That's what I quite like. Also, there's an aspect of plastic which I've liked historically, that there's a democratic thing whereby a plastic sword is there trying to tell you, is telling you, you know what, you can buy this fancy dress plastic sword. You can't afford a real gold sword, but with this too, it gives you the chance to sort of, there's something democratic about it, you know what I mean? For me, the work is built up with layers of material, but layers of meaning, you know, and layers of history as well. And then it reaches some, as I said before, it reaches some sort of equilibrium and stops.
Please, can you tell us about the use of antique share certificates in your work?
The story behind that is quite simple. I was in New York, I was participating in a museum exhibition, and I was out there in September 2008, and before I went there I was talking to assistants who were helping me in the studio saying, God, I hope we don't crash, I hope the economy doesn't crash, because we were in a credit crunch situation. And I was in New York, and 3 days after, so I'm in New York for an exhibition. 3 days after I arrived there, I wake up in the morning and all over the news, Lehman Brothers is closed, they're folded, they're gone. And that was traumatic. And then everything, like a pack of cards, the whole thing fell apart, and the massive global financial crisis happened. I came back from New York, like everybody, quite shaken and a bit traumatized, to be honest. And I had a meeting with an economist, and he was saying, well, what are you going to do? And I said, God, I don't know. And I suddenly had this inkling of an idea. I'd seen these share certificate documents selling in a shop, and I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to invest in dead companies. I'll do the thing you're not supposed to do, because you're supposed to run for the hills, you know, when all the financial crisis hits. No, I'm going to invest in companies who are dead for like 60 years, 50 years, you know, 30 years. And that's the beginning of it. And also then researching into the companies, and it just became an obsession. I moved from obsession to obsession, put it that way.
Mm-hmm. The work is titled Armada, yet it uses historic and contemporary materials. How does this reflect on migratory patterns?
As I'm sitting here in it, just before I was about to start talking about it, the first time I thought, the piece is called Armada, but a subtitle could be, where are we going? You know? And that's what I think about a lot. Where are we going? Where are these things going? And that's a question, an up in the air question. I mean, as for migratory patterns, I mean, today's immigrant, today's refugee is tomorrow's citizen, you know? I grew up in Guyana. The name means land of many waters. To get anywhere, you had to go by boat. So boats are in my DNA, shall we say? Yeah, they're part of who I am, and I feel about them in a very particular way. So it's logical that I would do this. I went to Guyana. I'm old enough to have gone to Guyana by boat. I came here for a brief time in the early 70s by boat again. On one boat, on this boat was, I think it was called the Montserrat. And It was part of a Spanish shipping line, which was bringing people from Jamaica, because Jamaica is one of the main stops, and from the Caribbean to live here. Basically, the post-Windrush generation. You know. And going to the Black Cultural Archive in London about 10 years ago, I saw a ticket which somebody submitted for their archive from this boat trip. People want simple answers about this stuff, migration and stuff like that. They don't really exist. Migration, history, all this stuff is extremely messy, you know. And the thing is, as I'm talking to you about this, and talking to whoever's going to listen to this, I'm thinking to myself, you know what, come back to me tomorrow and I'll have something different to say about it, you know, because what I think evolves and changes as days, weeks go by. This piece I'm sitting in right now, which is not complete yet. I'm still thinking, what do I think about it? I mean, I'm thinking, oh yes, the Windrush is in this boat right here. I've got the last thing to complete this project, Armada, was after hunting all over high and low, I finally found a tiny little boat here, which was a model of the Empire Windrush. To complete this piece, right, as I sit here, and I'm still making up my mind how I feel about it, the final important thing was finding a model of the Windrush, Empire Windrush, and that is placed right here in a barge. And the barge is a massive mess of history. It's got things like boats from the Elizabethan times, it's got chopped up bits of Mayflower, the Mayflower boat. It's got chopped up bits of history. It's just like a kind of rubbish bin of history, and the Empire Windrush is not part of that rubbish bin, I hasten to add, but it's in there as this linchpin, but very small. And I want people to know that it's there, you know, and know what it is. That's very, very important, because that says a lot about how things are today. I thought, like a lot of people, you know, well, that issue is settled, you know what I mean? That particular issue is settled. And that issue obviously wasn't settled, you know? This stuff is so hard to talk about. This stuff is so hard, because I'm talking, and as I'm talking about, okay, everything I've said so far in all of this, I would like, if possible, to go back and re-edit and chop and change and all that, but I will be chopping and changing tomorrow. I'll be shifting and tweaking tomorrow. I'll be shifting and tweaking in a year's time, constantly reassessing what it is I'm putting out there. Because, as I said earlier, the work I've got here, I thought about it one way when I made it, but now, today, as we're facing what we're facing with Brexit and the ideas of national identity and stuff like that, I'm rethinking it in different ways. The whole Windrush scandal makes me rethink what I'm putting out here, you know, because that Windrush scandal that was quite a shock, you know, and looking on Facebook at people I know who got caught up in this thing, you know, and yeah, and this makes you think, right, okay, so we're not as welcome as we thought we were, you know, which is kind of disturbing.
Thanks
very much. A negative note to leave it on there, but there we go.
Thanks so much.
Okay, no problem.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
That was good.
Okay, cheers, man.
That's really good.